Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Levy. I'm speaking from Israel, part of the EY Advanced Security Center here in Israel. And it's an honor to be here today with you at Red Team Village, Hack in the Box, especially at the UAE. Really an honor to be part of this. So I'm very happy and looking forward to this discussion. Today we'll be talking about zero trust networks, a buzzword we've been hearing a lot, and trying to place this more into the perspective of Red Team activities and what this means for us from Red Team and pen testing activity perspective. So as I mentioned, my name is Dan Levy. I'm focusing mostly in offensive security operations, cyber innovation, zero trust, all that stuff. In my free time, I'm a yoga Ashtanga instructor. I guess that's just for the quick slide on me. One quick disclaimer about this talk. Everything here is not based on EY's opinions or its affiliates. Classic disclaimer, as you can imagine. Today, what we'll be talking about is zero trust, which is overall a buzzword or a very important paradigm shift that occurred in cybersecurity approximately 7 years ago when the concept was first introduced. The idea of this concept is to change people's perspective on cybersecurity and to move it beyond we can call it the castle and moat perspective of security, where the perimeter is your first line of defense and everything that's behind your DMZ is considered as sensitive assets. So zero trust is basically this perspective where we stop the excessive focus on the perimeter as the checkpoint of your data security and apply a layered approach to security or to zero trust, which basically means don't just trust anyone because they're in your network. Validate and verify their behavior within the network in order to confirm if this behavior is compliant or not with security practices. So overall, zero trust is a concept. It's a theory. It's a very good one, and one that's basically taking cybersecurity by storm and convinced a lot of the cyber products to adapt their strategy to become zero trust products. However, zero trust in itself is a very big challenge also, in the sense that not everybody knows how to implement zero trust. Again, it's a concept. It's not a step-by-step guide. And so many companies, many products view zero trust differently, and the implementation is basically the major challenge. However, if we look at all the different theories around zero trust and how companies are applying zero trust, overall zero trust relies on three very important pillars. The first one is the network architecture. How are users accessing the network and how the network is structured. 2, IAM, or how users' roles and how is the access provided. And 3, monitoring, which is basically verifying the activities within the network on a recurring basis. And so within this context, COVID has become very helpful in the past few months to basically put even more focus on the zero trust concept, with, as you all know, remote workforce becoming even more important, cloud servers becoming even more relevant, where test applications are run, but also where workloads in general are run. And automation is becoming a more and more important theme as the workforce challenge in cybersecurity is imposing itself. So what we're going to do today, this was just for the introduction. What we're going to do today is basically I've taken this talk. It's basically a pivot from a previous talk that I held a few weeks ago at another, actually it was a few months ago, at another Red Team Village conference. And back then, the idea was to focus on the Israeli ecosystem, look at Israeli startups, and see how they're adapting and moving forward with this zero trust revolution. Since that talk, I've been receiving a lot of feedback. And so this entire presentation has been adapted from that original talk. And today the focus is not on Israeli startups, early stage startups anymore, but really on the new cutting edge product. Why? Because whereas in the past I was focusing only on Israeli startups, I've been receiving a lot of feedback from different companies, from different people, and from different countries as well, and startups as well. And of course, not only startups, of major companies that are working on sort of solutions that answer to the challenges that we're going to go over today. So what we're going to do is basically we're going to look at how zero trust is looking to be applied in the future within these key areas of cybersecurity, which are extremely important from the red team perspective. And we're going to look at what red teaming is going to look like in the future, assuming that these solutions within another 2, 3, 4 years become mainstream. As mentioned, solutions and these technologies that we're going to talk about are very cutting edge and next gen, but at the speed at which we're seeing cybersecurity move, we can predict very simply that within 2 years, they're going to become much, much more mainstream. And so the challenges we're going to cover today are basically the challenges that we can expect to be facing tomorrow. But throughout this presentation, I'll be talking about tips also that you can use in your red team operations today. And so the idea is that even though the implementation might be extremely relevant for 2 years from now, at least tomorrow you'll be able to start adapting already your TTPs to adapt to the new reality. So let's go straight into it. Remote workforce. We all know that remote access is key to any cyber strategy, from the perspective of services, whether it's SharePoint, Teams, or other Microsoft services, to protocols, SSH, FTP. We also know that third-party services or access or TeamViewer is one of them, and VPN, of course. Now, VPN deserves to be mentioned very importantly here, because VPNs are, until today, basically the overwhelming way that contractors, partners, and employees reach the network if they're not physically located inside the office. And overall, cybersecurity strategies for the past few years have been extremely reliant on VPN. And as you know, VPN has one main weakness, which is that once you're in, except if there's some very tight segmentation in your network and the VPN gives you access only to what you need, in general, VPNs give you widespread access in the network. And so from the red team perspective, once you're in, you're in. So in order to respond to this challenge, there are several solutions that came out recently. There are some in stealth mode, some still not, which have basically proposed a new solution where what they do is all the applications that some of your partners or contractors need to access the most. So for instance, your remote developers sitting in, let's say, Ukraine, need to access only one specific application. Instead of granting them widespread access to your entire network, you can grant them access only to those test environments and applications. And so the way it's done is that there are several solutions out there that propose an offering where they basically lift and shift your apps to the cloud and then provide a broker system where everybody logs into the same dashboard. And once you're logged into that dashboard, the InfoSec team basically has your profile configured to grant you access only to the specific applications, which are already in the cloud, not on-prem anymore. And so this platform enables InfoSec teams and IT teams to basically monitor access to these applications. And so this, of course, is extremely relevant in test environments. And this, what you can see here, is an example of a screenshot of how this would look like in real life in one of these tools. You can see all the latest sessions here of users that are accessing specific applications that belong to your network but are not in your network. They're all in the cloud, and you can see numbers of applications, what types of users, and how they're connecting. And so this is a solution that enables security teams to monitor access. So next important question, what does this mean for red teams? The first thing that it means for us is that, first of all, the applications that we're so fond of using as an entry point into the network, non-production applications, those applications that are less monitored than production applications, that maybe don't have as many security controls as the production applications, those that are basically our preferred way of entering into company networks, well, they become a harder access point. First of all, because they're not necessarily exposed externally. And if they are, the fact that they've been lifted and shifted to the cloud makes the hack a little bit more complicated, in the sense that if you own a server that's in the cloud, you don't necessarily have foolproof access to the internal network. A second aspect is that specifically once you even if you own access to a specific application, not necessarily in the network. You might have access to very sensitive information. You might have access to a sensitive application, but you're not necessarily in the network. So these are for the negative sides, I want to say. But there's some caveats here. First of all, we know from experience that all these lift and shift migrations to the cloud always leave room for misconfigurations. What looks very, very obvious and clear in theory, in other words, you migrate everything to the cloud, in practice has become very complicated. And where we see that the most is, for instance, imagine your traditional web application that has a database in the backend. And if suddenly you need to move that database into the cloud, you might have some issues with compliance, who are going to start asking you where are the keys stored, especially with new data security laws that are being imposed and all these monitoring and enforcements that you have to take care of to make sure that your keys are stored correctly and that the data is secure. Secondly, we just mentioned before, you own an application in the cloud, you don't necessarily have access inside the environment, but very often, as you know, cloud environments cloud applications have access to on-prem data. A very typical example is the web application that's been migrated to the cloud, but the database is still on-prem. If a user can bypass basically the security controls and gain access to a database that's on-prem, imagine a traditional SQL injection that gives you remote code execution on the database. There might be room for internal exploitation and ways to pivot and gain access in your network. So clues or tips for us in the future, a very important one, always be on the lookout for cloud misconfigurations, especially if you're touching an application that doesn't look like it was built yesterday, I want to say, or more like a legacy application. If it's hosted in the cloud, it's very probable that your legacy application that's been lifted and shifted to the cloud already also has some remnants on-prem. And so owning that environment might give you access to on-prem critical data. Another point is that very often it happens that there's some misconfigurations from the AWS perspective where security groups are misconfigured. And if you can't directly access a server from the internet, if you have an AWS account, you might be able to access that server thanks to your AWS account, even though it doesn't belong to the enterprise you're trying to own. That's something that we've seen in the past, and we're seeing at some clients, some misconfigurations that can occur. So very broad advice, always try to perform enumeration from the perspective of a server that's already in the cloud, not necessarily belonging to your client or to your target, but even do it from one of your applications. So if we remain on the theme of remote workforce, another very important theme is two-factor authentication. As you all know, bypassing two-factor authentication in red team operations can be a headache. And what we're seeing more and more is all these solutions that propose a behavior-based detection, which is more risk-based, less yes access or no access. It's a less binary access, but more based on behavior and risk ratings. And so what we're seeing is that there are many solutions that are arriving that propose anomaly detection and monitor access based on this. So how does it work? One of the most typical uses that we're seeing is one where the solution plugs in directly to your Active Directory. So a company doesn't have to apply a new solution, configure, move to the cloud. It's built in, it plugs into your AD. And on top of your Active Directory logs, it will apply machine learning algorithms in order to identify anomalous behavior. And based on that, monitoring, of course, sensitive access, sensitive users will be able to detect sensitive behavior or anomalous behavior. And very interesting, what they do as well is because they're plugged into your AD, if there is some suspicious behavior, out of nowhere, the end user will receive a two-factor authentication ping, and they will tell the user, you need to enter this PIN code in your service within the upcoming 3 minutes. If not, you're going to be booted out of your session. And so one of the ways that it looks is, here's an example where you see users categorized by risks, and you can see asset inventory, users and passwords, and more information. Now, why is this, or how is this important for red team operations? Well, because if in the past multi-factor authentication was a challenge, well, it's going to become even more complicated. It's giving us also less room for trial and error. Again, because these solutions are based on machine learning and anomaly detection, once the tool has built a baseline of behavior of users in the network, red team operations necessarily require very anomalous behavior. If you start scanning your network, it's something that your random network user doesn't necessarily do. Imagine, for instance, a red team operation where we've managed to gain control of an account which is neither a developer, neither an engineer, IT person, but just a random employee in the network, a business analyst. If suddenly leveraging this user, we intend to start scanning the network, these types of tools are going to flag it very, very soon or very quickly. And so this, from our perspective, from the red team perspective, leaves us less room for trial and error to try and to start enumerating the network and to try certain sensitive activities just to see if they're flagged or if they're blocked or not. Secondly, and this is very important, we all know from red team operations that service accounts are an ideal target. As you know, the passwords are renewed less frequently. The passwords are very often legacy passwords that haven't been changed sufficiently or recently. And more than that, the access that service accounts can give us in the network is in general very high. And these types of tools very specifically can categorize service accounts as high priority or high risk accounts and apply a higher level of machine learning and threshold analysis on top of these accounts in order to flag anomalous behavior. So on the surface, looks like bad news for us. But let's look at the good news. First of all, we know that machine learning is very impressive, but if we know and we target and we know how we're going to target an account or target a company, we can basically impersonate also the behavior. The same way we're impersonating users while we're hacking the network, we can also impersonate their behavior. So imagine a hack where instead of taking place over a few weeks, it'll take over a few months. Once you've gained access to a specific user and you have control over that user, instead of immediately making very noisy exploitation process, if you start with some very low threshold scanning, and then you move up little by little the intensity of your scanning, it might be that we can trick these AI engines into believing that this is traditional behavior. This user has, for the past few months, increased the way he's becoming or performing scans in the network, and the tool will be made to believe that the behavior is all right. And imagine this also from a DLP perspective. If you start extracting just one file per day, and then 2 files per day, and then more quantity of data as it goes on, the tool can be tricked. And completely linked to this, we don't know how effective this type of technology is. We still don't know how well it works. We don't have a lot of examples of high-profile hacks that were prevented by some machine learning algorithm that detected very anomalous behavior and immediately blocked the behavior. I'm not familiar with any one of these. From my previous talk, I received some people who asked specifically about these technologies, and who mentioned also some other companies, major companies that are working on some types of solutions that look like these. I still haven't found, if there is one, I'm looking forward to hearing from one, where an AI-based machine learning algorithm has detected and immediately blocked anomalous behavior in the network. And so what you can see here on the screenshot is an example of a specific aspect of the application of this product, which will flag only service accounts and gives you a level of security and how predictable the behavior is from these service accounts. This is just for an example, real life. So tips for tomorrow. You need to plan very well the way that two-factor authentication is going to be bypassed when you're performing a red team execution plan. And the idea is that whereas in the past we were talking of testing on non-production hours, so that the InfoSec team might not be monitoring, or there's only one guy monitoring instead of 10. Well, it looks like in the future we might be talking a lot more about testing during work hours, specifically so that our network traffic and our behavior can basically blend into the exploitation or normal behavior of activity inside the network. So test during work hours, use an IP that corresponds to the workplace or the country where the specific employee you've hacked would log into. And also something which would become very interesting in the few years to study is what types of users have more or less predictable behavior. We all know this from the perspective of privileged access. For instance, engineers or InfoSec team or IT staff will generally have more access. In the future, we're going to have to start working on which users are more predictable and more adequate from a hacking perspective. And here again, it looks like testing, hacking or gaining access to users with predictable behavior and widespread access will be more interesting from the hacking perspective. So this is it for remote workforce. But another theme that's very important to Zero Trust is the theme of cloud security. As you know, there are many, many tools that help companies scan and flag alerts within cloud servers. There are tools that focus more on the discovery side of things to enumerate your network and give visibility. There are other tools that focus more on threat detection, monitoring access inside the network or inside the cloud, within the cloud users and what the users are doing with their access to cloud servers. IAM focused, as you know, every single workload in the cloud has an IAM user role. And so there are a lot of tools out there that are there specifically to make IAM user roles behave according to the least privilege concepts. And governance, of course, due to data laws and privacy and compliance has become very important. So a lot of solutions are sitting specifically on your data in the cloud to protect how the data is stored, where the keys are stored, and how the data is secured at rest and in transit. And so basically all these tools that we'll be mentioning, what they do at the baseline is that, of course, they connect to your cloud environment. And the way they do this is that they need to be granted access in your cloud environment. The way they do this, being granted like a security auditor role, in order to perform some scanning and discovery of what's going on. And so, of course, very important, the shared responsibility model. What happens is that whatever happens between AWS and the customer, basically everything relies on API endpoints. This is something I took from a Blackout conference in 2018. We need to understand very well that the misconfigurations inside cloud environments don't necessarily happen at the customer level or within AWS itself. the misconfigurations that we can exploit are always here, where in between the customer and the cloud provider, whether it be AWS or another one. And so the focus from the red team perspective, what we're going to see right now, is to focus exactly and target our exploitation on this area, where the customer has, our clients have influence on the way they interact with AWS services. This is where we're going to have to start targeting our exploitation vectors. So moving on to what this means for us. Number one, bad news. Cloud environments are going to be more secure. We can't expect the same hacks that we've been seeing 2 years ago, where an S3 bucket was left open to the internet to become the norm 2 years from now. In the future, cloud environments are going to become more secure. Access is going to be more monitored and more scoped. However, from the hacking perspective, from the red team perspective, and I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of talks about that during this conference and other talks as well, there are more and more open source tools that are available and that enable us, from the red team perspective, to hack, enumerate, discover, identify flaws in cloud environments. Not only that, but most of them are very often open source and very easy to use. Not only that, but also we know that, and I can tell you by experience working with a lot of Fortune 500 clients, that very often the clients themselves don't know exactly which tools protect which type of area of their security stack. And so there's a lot of gray zones. They have this security scanning tool, but they also have this pipeline code scan in the cloud application. And then it leaves a lot of room for gray zones in the middle, and the customers themselves don't exactly know where they're protected and how they're protected. This is exactly where we as red teamers need to exploit and leverage this aspect. I'll put right here as well an example of some of these platforms that provide, the micro segmentation in the cloud. And this is also very important because, as you all know, the ABC of hacking is web application hacking, what we can say. And we know that basically the fact that a web app is now in the cloud doesn't necessarily mean that it's more secure. It might be a bit more secure, but if the application has a SQL injection or cross-site scripting, application level vulnerabilities remain relevant. And this is extremely important for us because it's telling us, look at how the world is moving. We're moving to the cloud, but the basics remains extremely relevant. And so this is something also good from perspective of knowledge management in our industry. So tips for the future. Number one, keep on enumerating. We know that cloud environments, by definition, are extremely dynamic. They're always changing. And it might be that if we start scanning a cloud environment today, the next day, the cloud environment is going to be completely different. This is just the nature of auto-scaling environments, especially in the cloud. And so what this means is that enumeration shouldn't be performed like we used to see it in a cyber kill chain linear process. It should be performed on a recurring basis, like a loop. You perform enumeration, take it forward from there, but in the back end, keep some enumeration running so that if a very low-hanging fruit suddenly arises or something is left open by mistake, that's the moment that we can breach in and gain access. Number two, from the persistence perspective, we can't imagine that the cloud environments are going to be as predictable as on-prem environments. Users are also, or the access that we can gain to cloud environments is going to become very, very volatile. And so for this reason, the persistence, it's always extremely important to have backup scenarios or backup plans. The moment you've gained access, leave persistence, open another door or leave something open so that you can get back access a different way. Because again, as we know, the monitoring technologies are becoming better and better. So for that reason, our exploitation scenarios will need to rely on second chance or on persistence opportunities. And so we're going to need to leave always some room open for persistence. I'll just take a 2 seconds before we move on to automation. Thanks. So automation is also one of those buzzwords in the industry, but in this case, it's also very, very relevant. Not just like zero trust. Automation is becoming extremely relevant in many aspects, and we're going to talk about two specifically here today. The first one is vulnerability management. As we all know, vulnerability management is one of those fields that was just waiting for innovation. It was waiting even not for disruption. It became time that vulnerability management programs, with their thousands of alerts per day, their hundreds of false positives, and security teams not even knowing where to start with all these alerts, it was time that some companies came here and applied some automation in order to help teams performing all this patching and misconfigurations, fixes manually with more automation. So we know that there are tools today that exist, such as one that you can see here as an example, that help security teams apply and use automated patching and perform this in an automated way so that they can fast forward the patching process. But there are also many other tools out there today proposing what we're calling more and more the self-healing aspect of things. And self-healing basically means an app that can by itself discover that it's being targeted and quarantine itself, remediate itself, and go back live. And we're seeing a lot of similar solutions that are coming in this field. And all of them are proposing, very targeted looks. So sometimes it's a one-stop shop that performs this for you. And sometimes it's based on, some of those SOAR platforms like Phantom or Demisto that enable you to build your own RPA workflows. Well, using those tools, you can also apply some self-healing mechanisms where the security teams are out of the loop and the technology can by itself discover if something is being hacked and automatically fix the issue. So there are some tools that are approaching these types of solutions more recently. And so let's focus on the red team again. What does this mean for us? Well, first of all, we can't expect, especially from the vulnerability management perspective, that some of those low-hanging fruits will remain always the same or to the same extent open to the internet. We know that with these tools that start automating the patching process, the low-hanging fruits, or those patches that are critical, are going to become less and less available for exploitation. And more important as well is that with automation, the time to respond is increasing. In other words, from the moment that there's a detection, if there's an automated playbook in place to apply a quarantine or an isolation or basically make the hack more complicated, there's a lot of, it's going to become more complicated for hackers to exploit end-to-end with just one way of breaching. And so these are for some of the more negative aspects, I would say, from the hacker perspective. But there are also some very strong points for us that we can talk about. Number one, we don't know how good this technology is. Even the automation side, very often there still is room for human error and for human intervention. What I mean by human error is, for instance, an automated playbook having a glitch inside, and where the company that's built this playbook thinks it's protected, there might actually be a glitch and something is missing there, and there's still margin of error that we can fit in. Number two, if you have legacy systems, imagine an automated patch being deployed on a system that basically can't accept the patch, or that has an operating system that's so outdated that the patch will basically mess up the server and make it crash. So for that reason, automation is a little bit viewed, I want to say, skeptically by some security teams, because they know that their environments or their IT teams will not accept to have automated patching performed so easily. Just push a patch when a server is using a legacy technology that might mess it up. That's one of it. Number two, the impact on time to detect doesn't change. As we know, from incident response perspective and security operations, MTTR is very important, but MTTD also has its say. And from this perspective, what we're seeing is we're not necessarily seeing an increase in time to detect. So for the overall time to respond is going to be minimally impacted by this on the detection side. Although, as we mentioned before, the response side is going to be enhanced. And last key aspect from the security workforce or teams, I want to say, we know that security automation tools, especially those that require you building your own playbooks, are being adopted slower than expected. And the reason why that is because security teams know that in order to use some of these automation platforms, they need some coding skills. And then suddenly, the information security teams doesn't need only a workforce with with high level of expertise in cybersecurity. They also need a blend of cybersecurity and coding skills, which makes basically the perfect candidate for workflow or playbook automation playbooks. Well, it makes this candidate very rare to find. And so for that reason, we're seeing a lot of companies that are very skeptical from the perspective of their staff, but also from the perspective of the technology, which relies on many integrations, many playbooks, many integrations with different tools, which can become a hassle to maintain in the long run. So from the red team perspective, two things. Number one, we're going to have to accelerate our exploitation phases. Because we know that response might come faster than expected, persistence, of course, is part of the answer, but the speed of our exploitation is going to need to increase. And as I just mentioned, persistence is also a key aspect of this. So this is to close a little bit around the subject of some of these key themes that we're seeing a lot. Another one I'd like to raise here is cybersecurity tools. I don't want to approach them this time as tools that can make our lives more difficult, but actually from the perspective of looking at them as tools that might open up opportunities from the red team perspective. As most of you know, the many cybersecurity tools today are cloud and SaaS-based. So that means that the companies or their clients very often, of course, this is not true for all the tools out there, but for many of them, and you have some ideas here on the screen from the logos that I'm sharing, where basically the login platform to access your dashboard to your cybersecurity tools is cloud-based and open to the internet. And in general, two-factor authentication is not enabled by default there. It means that if you can imagine a scenario like this, you breached an environment, you have access to a specific user, and if you have that Active Directory login, you might be able to access the platform. And imagine how a red team walkthrough will look like facing your client if you can show the client, the CISO or the InfoSec team at large, that part of the sensitive data that was accessed was gained thanks to either misconfigured or weak password or simply having this login interface open to the internet. I promise you, I can assure you, but from experience, the impact on the client is extremely high. Not only that, but we also know, recently I saw this blog about an open tool that is actually used for cloud monitoring in Kubernetes. And what happened is that the exploitation process took place is that the hackers gained access to the cloud environment. They owned the cloud environment. And in order to enumerate the cloud environment, they basically used a cloud monitoring tool, which was open source, that they pushed to the cloud that they were hacking. And then thanks to that tool, they managed to perform the enumeration, which is quite outstanding, right? They used a defensive tool from an offensive perspective. So at the end of your assessment, if you're performing a red team, some tips if you want some high impact towards your client, if you have domain admin, crack the passwords of the InfoSec teams. In general, we have those, or we know who are the IT staff that have a higher or more important role in security, and then try to log into one of these screens and see what you can get. I assure you, this is high impact. And if you can also demonstrate that you can delete logs from one of those platforms, I assure you, you'll have, I'm not sure if it will be a thank you note or a very big complaint, but basically you'll make the impact that you're expecting on the client. So this is a way to wrap it up regarding these platforms. So we've been talking about these solutions. As I mentioned, this talk is basically based on a previous discussion I made, which was focused on startups. But it's important to mention that the big industry players from Microsoft, Symantec, Palo Alto are also focused on these solutions. We all see on a monthly basis these acquisitions of startups and new technologies being released. In general, what we're seeing is that the big players like Microsoft and like Symantec, Checkpoint, and the rest are focusing more on acquiring some small startups that have some very disruptive technology. And they're looking more to partner with them at the beginning. And if they see that there's potential for growth and for integration, then they'll acquire the startup. There are also some actors, especially Symantec is a good example there, where what they do is they plug in all of their tools into one centralized dashboard, and they call that their zero trust platform for security. This is a trend that we're seeing also in the field of zero trust, which of course from the red team perspective is important, because if there's a lot of tools that belong to one vendor, we know that there's a higher probability that the tools will be able to communicate more easier between themselves. And Microsoft remains a key player. First of all, because of everything that I've mentioned until now, but also because some of the tools, and by that I mean Active Directory, I mean OWA that's still being used, Teams, SharePoint, of course, are critical tools from the perspective of zero trust, from the perspective of access, from the perspective of data, and from the perspective of the type of access that you get in the network. And not only that, but we know that Microsoft is now trying to deploy Sentinel, its SIEM, in the cloud. And also this is an important factor. We'll see how it plays in the upcoming few years. So to conclude, since we have just under 5 minutes, we can see that in general, there are several trends here. The major trends are AI, the fact that you can leverage AI from the detection perspective, from the security perspective. And number 2, cloud. Cloud is becoming even more relevant than before, because the entire environment is starting to mature. The cloud security environment is starting to mature. And we also know that there really is a need from customer or from company's perspective for solutions that can help them manage cloud security. Cloud imposes, I don't want to do a huge talk here about cloud, but basically cloud security is probably the main challenge of the decade from the security perspective, since it's also blurring the lines between where does the perimeter start, where suddenly your developers are in charge of the perimeter, and security teams are having a harder time chasing what they used to call the app owners are now basically the developers that can just open and close ports nearly as they wish. And so it's a major challenge. And so we're seeing that a lot of technologies are going there. Automation is also a key factor. We're going to see automation being pushed more and more, especially as there are more challenges from the workforce perspective, and having a skilled and trained workforce that keeps its data, its knowledge up to date. And of course, Microsoft, from Active Directory to all the tools we mentioned, critical player. So at the end of the day, it's a cat and mouse game. Everybody's running forward, and one day one wins, the next day the other one wins. And that's why cybersecurity is extremely fun from the offensive perspective. We always have to fine-tune, adapt our tools to our environment. And so I hope that this talk today covered some aspects of how you can fine-tune your TTPs and your upcoming Red Team campaigns in the weeks or days to come. Of course, I'm available if you want to discuss. Feel free to reach out either on Discord, on LinkedIn. You can find me. You can even ping me by mail. I would rather you ping me on LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out if you have any insights, questions, or want to share some fun stuff. I also had a lot of that last time. Feel free to reach out and feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. Looking forward. And again, a very big thank you to the organizers here. It's an honor being part of this Hack in the Box Cyber Week in the UAE. So thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to keeping the discussion going. Thanks a lot, everyone.